So medieval battles were usually extremely bloody affairs, soldiers on both sides becoming possessed beasts as they tried to destroy opposing armies. The capture of prisoners during these battles would have been an extremely enticing concept, as ransoms for some important captives could reach up to a year's wages or even more for some soldiers. In theory, if someone important was disarmed or captured during the battle, they would play no further part in the fighting and their life would be secure. However, this wouldn't always be the case, as sometimes these prisoners were massacred in the heat of battle, such as during the Battle of Agincourt. The savagery of the battle saw bodies lying in heaps, with some even as tall as a man. Many of them were actually alive, prevented from rising due to the weight of their armour. While some were dispatched for a knife through their helmet visor, others were pulled out and taken as captives and sent to the back ranks. A lull in the 3-hour-long fighting seemed to mark an astonishing victory for the English, where they had captured roughly 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners, but at this point, no one is sure exactly what happened next. At some point during the battle, cries went up that the English baggage train that was situated behind them came under attack, and also that the French third line was now regrouping for a counterattack. The valiant English victory was now threatened with defeat, as they were exhausted, out of formation, and vulnerable to a fresh charge. King Henry V now made a call that would have been unheard of at the time, that all French prisoners, bar the most important, were to be massacred. Henry's immediate concern was that the prisoners still in full armour would overwhelm their guards, pick up weapons off the floor, and join in on the counterattack. Henry's knights were absolutely horrified and refused, firstly due to chivalrous code, and mainly due to the thought of the ransom money they could get out of these captured men. Henry was not deterred by this refusal and ordered 200 of his archers to execute these prisoners under pain of execution. The French prisoners who had surrendered to guarantee their life were now brutally massacred as their throats were slit or burnt alive in the buildings they were being held captive in. Even by 15th century standards, Henry's massacre of prisoners was an extremely nasty crime under the laws of chivalry. Whether it was a tactical move or done in cold blood, Henry's massacre had paid off, as the French now fled their field as they saw their prisoners being massacred, and he had won a great victory on the fields of Agincourt. So this first-rate chap here is Richard III, King of England from 1483 until 1485, where his reign came to a sudden end after his brutal death at the Battle of Bosworth Fields. The 22nd of August 1485 saw these two men here line up their armies on what would be the final battle of the 30 Years' conflict that was the Wars of the Roses, as one of them would take the crown of England. Sources suggest that Henry had an army that totalled up to 5,000 men, whereas Richard outnumbered him with around 8,000. During the battle, Richard saw Henry a fair distance away from his army and led a small cavalry charge of him and his finest men in an attempt to end the battle quickly and kill the enemy commander. Richard fought bravely as he killed Henry's standard bearer and unhorsed one of his bodyguards. He caught Henry and his men extremely off guard and came within a sword's distance of striking down the future King of England, almost altering history forever. Henry's men managed to drive Richard away, where he was unhorsed on some marshy grounds. Richard was now surrounded alone and refused to surrender, stating, "God forbid I retreat one step, I will either win this battle as a king or die as one." King Richard was viciously battered to death, and his skeleton, which was discovered in 2012, gives us some brutal insight into his last breaths. His skeleton had 11 wounds total, 8 of which were to the head by multiple different weapons, suggesting he was surrounded and beaten to death by many different men. He was believed to be without a helmet at this point due to the severity of the wounds on his skull, and they believe the fatal blow was this one here, number 6, where the bottom of his skull got chopped off, exposing his brain. This is how Richard would have received his wounds, with the fatal one being this one here, the halberd to the back of the head, but he also received a sword to the back of the head, which also could have been the fatal one as well. After his battle on the way to get buried in Leicester, he was likely stripped naked, and he received a nice dagger in the bottom, as pictured here, to add insult to injury. The death of Richard saw Henry Tudor take the throne and crown himself King of England as Henry VII and start the Tudor dynasty. So in July 1302, the French suffered an absolutely devastating defeat to the Flemish forces as mounted French knights were cut down in droves against a bunch of townsfolk in a battle which ushered in the infantry revolution of the 14th century. The Battle of the Golden Spurs, as it's known today, saw its origin as the county of Flanders began to rebel against French rule. Nobles in the towns of Flanders had exclusive rights to the wool imported from England, making many of them quite rich, and created a conflict between them and the lower classes, and many towns were split into the pro-French called the Lilies and pro-Flanders called the Lions. May the 17th in the town of Bruges saw the French hold an extravagant festival, bringing with them 2,000 soldiers, and raised taxes in the city to pay for this, and this was now the tipping point for many Flemish people. The morning of the 18th saw every French sympathiser they could find massacred as they were weary from the night of partying before in what would come to be known as the Matins of Bruges, where roughly 2,000 people were killed. More people from Flemish towns joined in rebellion, and now King Philip IV of France sent an army of 8,000 strong to crush these oiks. On July the 11th, the two forces met outside the town of Courtrai, which the Flemish were besieging at the time. The Flemish army consisted of around 8 to 10,000 men who were all decently trained, wielding spears, swords, pikes and crossbows, and only around 400 men at arms, as many nobles had defected to the French. The 8,000 French, although being slightly outnumbered, had around 3,000 knights, and they believed one knight was worth 10 foot soldiers, so they were extremely confident they would slaughter these Flemish forces who dared stand up to them. The Flemish had set up a marshy ground with a river covering their flanks and dug numerous ditches and streams to lessen the effect of cavalry charges, and the battle begun with a crossbow skirmish between the two sides. The French knights were growing impatient now and believed it was their time for glory, so charged into the battlefield, even trampling some of their own men who didn't move out the way in time. The Flemish were set up in pike squares to receive the charge, which didn't get up to full speed due to the boggy ground and ditches, and they didn't flinch as horses crashed into the men, and the French knights were absolutely slaughtered. The French responded with an infantry charge, which did cause some damage to the Flemish lines, but they were soon surrounded and started to rout, seeing the massacre that had happened to their knights. When the day was done, roughly 1,500 French lay dead, compared to only 1 to 300 Flemish, in one of the earliest battles where foot soldiers defeated mounted heavy knights. The next day, the Flemish collected 500 pairs of spurs from fallen knights and hung them in the nearby church, and from this the battle gets its name of the Battle of Golden Spurs. The battle showed that a supposed godly knight can now be defeated with a commoner with a spear. So in the aftermath of a medieval battle, soldiers were often chased down by the victorious side in order to capture them for a juicy ransom, or just to stick a sword through the head because they didn't really like them. One such absolutely strange story comes in 1385 in the aftermath of the Battle of Aljubarrato between Castilian forces, or modern day Spain, against the Portuguese, where legend tells us that Castilian soldiers were dispatched by a lady with 6 fingers. Aljubarrato saw a heavily outnumbered Portuguese force take up a defensive hillside position against the Castilian force bolstered with French heavy cavalry, and customary to French knights at the time, they charged in before the Castilian infantry was there to support them. The French were either captured or killed, and when the Castilians arrived, they held out until around sunset until they saw their royal banner fall, and they thought the king who had led them into battle might have died, so they began to retreat from the battlefield. However, he didn't die. Around 5,000 Castilians had been killed or injured during the battle, and the Portuguese were out for blood and pursued them down the hill, and over the course of the next day, 5,000 more Castilians died from the pursuers and the inhabitants of the nearby town, killing them as well. Our 6-finger lady now comes into play, a woman named Brits de Almalda, I've probably butchered that so I apologise, who was described as burly and ugly, ran a bakery in the nearby town, supposedly having the best bread in all of the country. Brits had gone out to find some Castilian stragglers upon the news of the Portuguese victory, however when she returned home, she found that her door was closed, arousing her suspicion. Hiding in her baker's oven, she found 7 men in there who didn't respond to requests for them to leave or surrender, so she done what any normal person done and brutally murdered them with her 6 fingers hands, with other stories saying it may have been with a shovel, and then she cooked them all along with her amazing bread. How true this story is up for debate, but Brits de Almeida has become an iconic symbol of Portuguese independence, even appearing on a postage stamp in 1927. So the Crusades were known to be quite a brutal affair, and this was in full show in 1098 after the siege of Mara, where rumour has it that some hungry crusaders turned to cannibalism against their defeated Muslim foes. Despite a successful siege of Antioch in the summer of the year, the Crusaders had failed to protect their supply lines, leading to widespread deaths from thirst, hunger and fatigue. Horses were the first to be sacrificed for food, as well as their veins opened up for blood to drink, and thirst was so great among many men, they asked their companions to collect their urine in their hands before drinking it again, so nothing would go to waste. The Crusaders were to continue south from Antioch all the way until Damascus, and Mara, which is around here, was an important trade city en route, and it was only held by local civilians and a small militia garrison. In July of 1098, the garrison held off a Crusader expedition in an overwhelming victory, before in November of the year, the city came under siege. Lack of supplies meant the Crusaders couldn't wait out a long winter siege, and terms of surrender were repeatedly rejected by the defenders as they held out assaults for around 2 weeks. The construction of a siege tower finally allowed the Crusaders to take the city, where the defenders negotiated a surrender for safe passage, and Crusader leaders Baymond of Taranto and Raymond IV of Toulouse now started debating on who got to keep the conquered lands. The city of Mara also wasn't as rich as the Crusaders hoped, and now they are on the verge of starvation, and for the next 3 days, the remaining inhabitants of the city were put to the sword as the Crusaders broke their oath of safe passage. As the dispute between the Crusader leaders carried on for over a month, the bodies of the slaughtered Saracens were hacked to pieces and boiled in cooking pots in a desperate attempt for hungry soldiers to feed themselves. How true the reports of Crusader flesh munching are though, is unknown, as it doesn't appear in any Muslim chronicle, and you'd likely think these guys would be blasting out as propaganda to say how savage these Crusaders really were to get people to attack them at any opportunity. However, it's not hard to imagine soldiers on the brink of starvation in an extremely hot and hostile climate doing anything they can in order to survive.